David Joseph Kolb. We're in Manhattan. It's the second day of the Garn Press author celebration. We were at the Strand last night, and we've just finished a session at Mercy College, so we're coming off that, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But first of all,
it was a magical event.
That's very nice of you. I was very nervous. I think that all of our authors did an incredible job. But we're here to talk about Devil Knows,
A Tale of Murder and Madness in America's First Century.
Which we published it's a few months since we published the book.
It seems like yesterday.
And it's doing very well. Tell us a little bit about how you got started with the book.
The impetus for Devil Knows arose out of a piece of research I did for a novel that I was considering to take place about 100 years or so later, during the French and Indian War period of the mid-1700s. That was a period that I'm very familiar with. In fact, in college I minored in history and wrote a big paper on that period. So I was kind of familiar with that, and that's what I was working with. But in the course of my researches, I came across a rather startling incident that I had never heard about, and that was the relentless persecution of the Quakers by the Puritans, our forefathers here in America. And it was just shocking to learn about these really terrible, brutal mistreatment of another religious sect by the dominant religious sect, the dominant theocracy of the time, which was the Puritan theocracy, beloved in literature as these stern men and women in black and white and humorless, but they had quite a violent streak to them. So I came across this incident of not only persecution of the Quakers, but the actual rescue of 3 Quaker women who had been sentenced to be whipped to death across New England in the dead of winter. But after having traveled to 2 or 3 villages, they were then rescued by a remarkable man, Major Robert Pike, who was a resident of Salisbury, Massachusetts. There is in fact a statue of devoted to Major Pike, who was almost never shows up in our history books, but he was an extraordinary figure. So I wrote that short story, basing some of the narrative on a poem by a Quaker poet, John Greenleaf Whittier, who was an anti-Puritan sentiment, so to speak. He harbored. He wasn't that far removed from the Quakers, only a couple of hundred years, and but he still felt a lot of moral outrage about what had happened to his co-religionists, and wrote a poem, How the Women Went from Dover, which was kind of a narrative of this outrage and rescue. So I wrote the short story. I called it An Insurrection. And before I was finished with it, I decided that this would make a great novel. The incident itself took place in the middle of the 1600s, in the middle of the 17th century, which left kind of an interesting period there. There was 30 years prior, which included the founding of Boston, and 30 years after, which included the horrible period known as the Salem Mania, or the Salem Witchcraft trials of 1692. I needed a fictional character to get us through all of that, and I had some historical figures to get us into the story. And that's what happened. That was the genesis of Devil Knows.
What was so interesting was when we asked if we could publish one chapter, that was the chapter
Yes.
that we chose. And I
Yes.
didn't know the story. I mean,
Yes.
I didn't know that that was the story.
That was the
beginning of
that
the
was
book.
the beginning, and
was
now it's in the middle of the book, roughly.
and
chronologically.
and it's now on the Garn Press website, so readers could read it and then
Yeah, I mean,
go out and
if
get the book.
we ever have a class or a seminar on rewriting, the history of that chapter and how it got placed in different parts of the book is also very interesting. It originally served as the prologue to the novel, but you and I both felt, you as my editor, both felt that it belonged in a different place, and as it turned out, it's in the right place right now. Even though it started out as the only plot point and as the original prologue, now it's in its rightful place. Interesting.
One of the things that I was struck by when I first read the book was how carefully I think the novel is very honest and straightforward, but also you've been very careful in holding history in your hands, that many people in society have a very different view of what happened at that time. And so the novel is both fiction, but it is also in some ways a revelation for people who are reading it, leading them to think of that time differently. Were you aware of that when you...
I was aware of some of it. I mean, we're all aware of, because of plays like The Crucible, Nathaniel Hawthorne's classic Scarlet Letter. I mean, we know of the Salem Witchcraft era.
And yet
there's been
we
much...
still celebrate witches and...
Well, we don't. It's not a celebration of witches.
Halloween?
None of these women were witches.
Halloween?
They were.
No, of course
they
not.
were.
That's what
they were accused
yeah.
of. They were accused of witchcraft. It was a horrible outrage, and it was a tremendous miscarriage of justice, which even the authorities at the time recognized. Not so many months into the persecutions and the mania, which they just suddenly halted and basically, pointed to something else and say, look what's going on over there. Let's forget about all this.
But we still hold on to the myths and a very different notion of witches.
Yes, well, the witch, the people of the time, the people of the 1700s in New England and all across Europe, Denny, even the most enlightened of them, even the most heroic figure in my book, Major Pike, they all believed in witchcraft, and they all believed that this was all possible, that not only was it possible, but there were real witches and real agents of devil out among them, seeking to overthrow the kingdom on earth for the kingdom of hell. This was a legitimately recognized belief that was not in dispute among the contemporaries of the characters in my book. Cotton Mather, the Reverend Cotton Mather, who is a notorious and infamous figure in history, called it the invisible world. And he believed that there was a parallel world. And he made a convincing argument for that time that there was a parallel world in which evil ruled, the devil sent his minions hither and yon to cause mischief and murder and mayhem. And this invisible world always threatened the Puritan world. And as a result, the Puritan world was a paranoid world, a world in which even the slightest signs were misinterpreted as being a sign that Satan was among them and was ready to strike. And you can understand their fear because they lived in a narrow sliver of America, which at the time was populated by enormous, towering trees and forests, and it was dark and gloomy, and it's hard to say what kind of other things were going on. The diet, I'm sure, was pretty bland. You never knew what the next ship was going to bring. You never knew what the relationships with their Indian neighbors was going to bring. There was no media to tell them what was real and what wasn't real. All the facts they needed to know they got from their grim ministers and their grim pulpits every Sunday, which, by the way, if you didn't attend, you were in dire trouble. You could be physically harmed, or you could be, in effect, murdered, because you would be exiled without and shunned, which left you without any support or resources in a very hostile wilderness. So the idea of devil out there was a real one for them.
The other side of that in the book, I think, is hope. That it is a hopeful book, and it is a book about human values, morality, and there is a tension between, I think, this view of the time and the history, and the people themselves who were hopeful and were in some way responding to the events. And Hope Still himself, just the name Hope Still, the main character in your book. Can you talk about that tension?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. Hope Still. I really loved Hope Still, Carrie. I mean, I love the character. There were at least 2 Hope Still Fosters that I know of in actual history. So the name is a real name of real people who existed. But the fictional character himself, Hope Still Foster, is a composite of many, many different kinds of characters that were extant in the wilderness of New England at that time. And I wanted a character who was not completely innocent, but who was a moral, decent character, because the historical hero of the book, Major Robert Pike, is almost a little bit too good. He's almost too upright. He's a John Wayne sort of a guy, and he was real. I mean. But, I don't want to say he's my mentor, but he's my muse. John Gardner would say, moral fiction is instructive in a lot of ways, because it can help readers to understand how to make things better. And as writers, we should aim to strive for a certain moral aspect to our fiction, and that's one of the things that I believe in. I wanted it to be a hopeful book. I'm not going to say how it ends, because there's a lot of tragedy and heartbreak that occurs, but there are some hopeful things.
And Hope Still, I think, will become one of the great American characters in literature. I think he's an extraordinary character, and he carries the book, and I think he carries you too. I'm always, when I read the book, and when Hope Still is there, you are there. In a way, actually, I haven't picked up with Pike, but definitely with the Hope Still has flaws, but he is moral, and he is a strong character.
Yeah, he's a tragic figure.
It would be marvelous if he becomes an American character that goes through the years.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're so kind.